buildings and transportation, but we were starting this urban leader of adaptation initiative with 9 U.S. cities plus Toronto, and realized that same framing, what we build, where and how, has a huge impact on vulnerability or resilience. So it got me started exploring this. So I was at the Center for Clean Air Policy for almost 20 years, consulting on my own, green resilience strategies with some collaboration with Deb and Allison. Glad to be back together. And next month I'll be coming in as the executive director of the Ottawa Climate Action Fund, one of the low carbon Canadian city centers that is modeled off the Atmospheric Fund in Toronto and is being incubated by the Ottawa Community Foundation. Very exciting because we're really grounding what we're doing on in social inclusion and equity. So um, we always start presentations with disaster photos, so I'll go ahead and do it. Melting runways, buckling rail, flooded shipyards, flooded streets, damaged bridges, people evacuating from fire. We need to certainly focus on the problem, but we also really need compelling solutions. And by compelling, I mean solutions that multi-solve. And that's really what we're here to talk about. Um, I'm seeing Alexa that some people are having trouble hearing. Do you hear me okay? Shall I continue?
I do hear you. I believe the issue might be that some are still trying to log into the teleconference line.
Great, okay. Great. So the phone line is in place to hear folks. I'm going to talk about the what, the why, and how of green resilience. And to be clear, what I call green resilience is what Deb and Allison refer to as low carbon resilience, anything different. So what is green? Now I'm getting confused. What is green resilience? It's the intersection of adaptation and mitigation. Examples such as green infrastructure, solar plus storage, resilient urban transport, water and energy conservation, building weatherization. And I first came across this type of image in an adaptation study for the city of Toronto that I believe the Clean Air Partnership did. And it was an adaptation study. And what they said is, there are measures that have both adaptation and mitigation benefits, but really the focus of this report is adaptation. And so they left it there. And that's typical, and fair enough. It's hard enough to do just adaptation or just mitigation. But really, the middle of the Venn diagram is supposed to be the important part, at least the interesting part. And so I found it interesting in sort of, collecting examples of green resilience measures in different sectors, energy, buildings, water, transportation. But before we sort of say, gee, that's interesting, let's talk about why it might be important. Yes.
Steve, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. Maybe if we could just pause for 1 minute. We're still getting a lot of messages about people not being able to hear, and I do want them to be able to hear you. So if you wouldn't mind just pausing for 1 minute, we'll try to fix the problem. Thank you. I do apologize to everyone else. If you can, this is Alexa. If you can hear me clearly, please type so in the chat box so that we can understand where the static or anything may be coming from. But we do encourage everyone to use the teleconference line. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of messages coming in that it is clear now once they've been able to make it to the teleconference line. We're going to proceed in just a little bit, but if anyone is still having any difficulties, please say so now.
And let me just ask, can people agree?
I believe people can hear you. It might just be a matter of it being a little staticky.
Okay.
Steve, do you have earphones and microphone?
Is that any better?
Yeah. Okay, it's looking at us much better. So please do proceed. I'm sorry for interrupting you. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying. I appreciate that. Okay, so be worthwhile to pursue such measures. And the first is that we can save time and resources by doing integrated planning. We can avoid duplication of effort, avoid missed opportunities, and prevent building in future vulnerability. We can protect investments and increase return on investment. That's investments in mitigation, adaptation, and infrastructure. And we can achieve multiple co-benefits, health, social, economic, etc. With multiple benefits, we have the opportunity to attract multiple funding and investment sources, all aimed at accelerating implementation of shovel-worthy projects and programs and policies. Two core principles of green resilience are efficiency and redundancy. So, end-use efficiency of energy and water, transport system efficiency, and by redundancies, I mean complement backup options such as distributed generation, energy storage, integrating green and gray infrastructure to prevent flooding, and multimodal networks for transportation. The benefits really accrue for infrastructure system resilience. If we're putting less load on the system, we reduce the probability of disruption, we can reduce recovery time, we can reduce operation and maintenance costs, and thereby increasing level of service, carrying capacity, and useful life. First example I'll share is just green roof, which can cut stormwater runoff by half, thereby reducing combined sewer overflows and also reducing the energy required for water treatment. By the way, so-called blue roofs that have some water retention equipment, not vegetation, can also store half of annual precipitation, but with a lower net present value because they don't bring the multiple benefits that green infrastructure can, that I'll talk about in a moment. By the way, since we're talking about transportation, permeable pavement strategies can also reduce runoff significantly by half or even up to 90%. When we look at green roofs, the image on the left, you can see that a green roof, and on the right, an asphalt roof. The infrared photo on the right side of the screen, you can see that the asphalt roof is 44 degrees warmer than the green roof, which has significant impact on building energy load for cooling. And the green roof can cut cooling costs. By the way, painting a roof white can also cut energy costs. A lot cheaper, not bringing the other benefits, but certainly a strategy to consider when you have a high cooling load. More applicable in many parts of the U.S. than Canada is considering. And green infrastructure benefits really accrue when we're at scale. So for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, for flood mitigation, for reducing urban heat islands, with benefits such as habitat, water quality, health, beauty, and equity if it's targeted in vulnerable neighborhoods. And that can come through measures such as green roofs, which in Toronto, a study about a decade ago showed could save $300 million at full penetration. Measures such as integrating green infrastructure into street design, as we see here in Washington, D.C., or urban tree canopy strategies. And that can direct economic benefits because the green infrastructure solutions can be cheaper than the gray infrastructure solutions. So putting in green infrastructure and vegetation as opposed to, more likely, as a complement to gray infrastructure, whether it's water filtration plants, tanks, tunnels, etc. And looked at from a benefits perspective, the benefits of green resilient measures can be much higher, of green infrastructure can be much higher than just the gray. And again, typically in a blended context. That can have direct benefits for active transportation. Just having shading for pedestrians and cyclists can make that mode that much more attractive. And so it's green resilience, and that we're helping a low carbon mode be more likely to attract users. I'll tell you a little bit about, and let me just do the audio check real quick since we had problems. Alexa, seems clear now?
It does, yes.
Great. In 2007, there was a significant storm in New York City that flooded the subway. And if you can if I got the arrow right, these ventilation grates at the top of the ceiling here in the subway wound up serving as a drain for city streets and bringing water into the subway, causing a lot of flooding. The city did a lot of thinking and planning and studying to respond to this. One of those solutions to protect this low carbon form of transportation, the subway, was to put in to raise the ventilation rate, just by several centimeters. But by doing that, adding a bike rack, adding benches for pedestrians, I think they get double green resilience points. We're already protecting low carbon transport, but now we're doing it in a way that supports active transport. The city looked at a number of other measures after this storm, including other operational solutions such as moving subway cars out of low elevation to higher elevation locations in advance of the storm, something that they were able to do during Superstorm Sandy that actually New Jersey Transit didn't do in some cases and suffered some serious losses. They also, for the first time, realized, we could shut the system down in advance of a major storm. Something they did as trial run during Irene, superstorm that did not hit New York directly, but it prepared the public for the idea that you might get an announcement that says subway's going to be closed tomorrow. Make other plans. Now, of course, these days of the pandemic, we're all too familiar with shutdowns, but that was novel at the time. The first time New York City did that, and then they're prepared when Sandy came around. Now, I call these partial solutions because this is good for a few centimeters of water, but not for if you have a storm surge, right? If you have a meter or more of water. In that case, you really need to protect the station with some deployable solutions that are really going to prevent higher flows of water, to prevent kind of image on the right here, or other deployable solutions to cover stairwells or this very cool inflatable tunnel plug, which I would love to see in person but never have. Another example in Toronto, 2005 storm caused $660 million of damages citywide, $4 million just here at Finch Avenue. It's interesting to sort of go through the steps of what happened, which was that major storm, wind, branches breaking off of trees, falling into the creek, going downstream, and eventually clogging up the culverts and blowing out that segment of road, which, by the way, also includes infrastructure for telecom, electricity, and gas. Fortunately, no explosions or any injuries there. What the city learned from this is that culverts are no longer, in the age of climate change, a design and build solution. It's design, build, inspect, maintain to prevent this type of damage, and when it's time to replace a culvert, to right size it, taking into account more intense precipitation events and more frequent ones expected under climate change. Get this. The other thing to think about in terms of green resilience solutions is around evacuation, whether it's from hurricane or fire. First of all, it can be a significant source of emissions. Second, the picture in the middle, the evacuation from Hurricane Rita in Houston, 2005, there were no deaths from the storm itself. The deaths came from traffic accidents, for people scrambling to get out of town, which brings to mind the need for solutions such as using public transit to get out of town. New Orleans has these sort of evacuation spots so people know where to get the bus, or shelter-in-place options like this picture on the right in Miami, where the university fortified a library so the students could stay overnight and ride out the storm, not be exposed to the risks of being in traffic or the emissions associated with it. And when we think of sort of the transportation impacts of different modes, from single occupancy vehicles to eventually, I guess, we'll have zero occupancy vehicles with automated vehicles and full zombie cars, to carpooling, public transit, cycling, walking. Like, we want to prioritize those low carbon modes, and we think of this as mitigation. But if you consider, when you have multiple modes, when you have network redundancy, you have backup options. If one part of the network, one mode of transport, or one energy source goes down, there are other solutions, whether it's bike or walk or pedestrian. And having that accessibility Another example is our plug-in hybrids, something that I don't think gets a lot of attention. Um, we always think of them as sort of a stepping stone to the real goal of electric vehicles. And that makes a lot of sense from a mitigation perspective. But with a plug-in hybrid, you have a backup plan, right? If there's a power outage or a fuel shortage, you could use a different energy source. What's interesting, a study last year from the University of California showed that in city driving, plug-in hybrids use electricity most of the time, which isn't surprising if you're driving, 20, 30 kilometers a day. That's well within the range of that vehicle. But I do think there's a need for a second generation of plug-in hybrids. The first generation is like, got a hybrid, add a plug-in option, and a plug-in hybrid. They weren't designed for optimal efficiency and interoperability.
Their speakers weren't working, so we had to teleconference
Hello?
for sound.
I've got someone speaking in the background. Someone's unmuted. And so if we have an interoperability with plug-in hybrids, then you'd really have that backup option. Something goes down, you can still get around. But it points to the need as we electrify everything, as we electrify buildings and cars and public transport, that we need a resilient power system. Power outages cause more than $160 billion of losses in Canada each year, and climate change is a threat multiplier that can increase those outages through extreme weather events, through branches knocking power lines, and just through more stress on aging equipment. And by the way, as we have more cooling degree days, as it gets hotter out, we need to run air conditioning more and increase cooling loads that can put more stress on the system. Distributed generation, such as distributed photovoltaic, can help reduce losses from power outages by 20%, according to a recent study, with a 5-to-1 benefit to cost ratio that would be even higher if battery storage were included. Which reminds me of in Superstorm Sandy, New York City, there were gas stations that had fuel underground that first responders needed, but they didn't have the power, the electricity to pump it out of the ground. And so they now, NYSERDA, the State Energy Research Board, put forward a program that gas stations could actually have some batteries to pump gasoline when there is a power outage. And there's a municipal refueling facility in Boston for municipal fleets that added photovoltaic and battery storage with that kind of redundancy and resilience in mind. Skip over this one for now. If we look at one important strategy for power sector resilience is combining different solutions, distributed generation, energy efficiency, storage, could be thermal systems as well, in microgrids that can help reduce emissions, improve grid reliability, and maintain business continuity. Anything we can do to take stress off the grid, again, will increase the resilience and reliability of anything depending upon it. So, there's a lot of interesting ideas out there. How can we move forward on green resilience? First of all, if you're putting in, for example, a renewable, a photovoltaic field, solar array, consider are there options for storage? Is the grid resilient there? Is your investment safe? So you can really get the low carbon resilient energy. If you're updating building codes for, let's say, flood and earthquake, make sure you're considering energy efficiency, location efficiency, water efficiency, have truly resilient green buildings. And if you're doing transit-oriented development, something I've been working on for a long time, trying to create these 15-minute walkable neighborhoods, let's make sure we're not building in a floodplain. Let's maximize green infrastructure to truly have green and resilient neighborhoods. We also need to follow the money. I put together this exercise for some workshops where it could be for a city department or a company. The question is, what are your top 3 investments in adaptation, in mitigation, in infrastructure? And I made up some numbers here to make the point that when we talk about climate change, we're usually talking about millions of dollars. But when we talk about the infrastructure, it's billions. So we've got to look at that. And when we're following the money, it's not just about climate change. It's about health and habitat and critical infrastructure and economic development. If we can multi-solve, if we can package our projects and programs to be attractive to multiple funders and investors, we can get to scale more quickly. And when we're following that money, government is maybe 20-25% of capital investment. And we've got to look at that
70 to 80% that's in the private sector. If we are not fostering the market conditions and creating the policy framework that attract and steer private investment into low carbon resilient solutions, we're not going to meet our goals. And so I think we need to ask the climate question. For every time we spend money, when we develop a project or make a plan, we're asking simply, is it making it better or worse? Are we increasing emissions or decreasing them? Are we increasing vulnerability or increasing resilience? While we're at it, we should ask, are we increasing social inclusion or exacerbating inequities? Ask the climate question. If you remember one thing from my talk, please remember that. And I think the Infrastructure Canada climate lens goes, makes a critical first step toward asking this question. And as I've talked to Infrastructure Canada, I think we can go further. I think we have to answer the climate ambition question, ask not just what are the impacts, but how can we increase the benefits? How can we increase greenhouse gas savings? How can we improve resilience through technical assistance, such as simple checklists, best practice guidebooks? If you're doing this type of project, here are some things you should consider to increase benefits. Incentives, support and packaging proposals for multiple funders. And I won't go into the details, but there are many potential project modifications that can enhance adaptation and mitigation benefits. And I'll acknowledge I'm rushing through this pretty quickly, partly because that's what I do, but probably we're a little bit delayed here. But you have access to all these slides and look forward to the Q&A afterwards. So we need to ask the climate question, not just of our climate change plans, policies, and budgets, but infrastructure, energy, transport, land use, flood management, housing, health. Again, what we build, where, and how makes a difference. We got to get out of our silos. And in the adaptation world, we struggle with what are appropriate metrics for adaptation, for resilience. And here's one I'll offer. We want to avoid this particular regret that you've heard before. Oh, I wish we would have, we opened up that street to improve drainage, we closed it back up. We didn't think about it, expanding the sidewalks, or we're putting in bike lanes. We didn't think about coordinating with the other city departments to plant some trees and improve green infrastructure. We've got to use our scarce funding wisely to maximize the benefits. The solutions are much more often institutional than technical. A paper I contributed to a couple of years ago, that Deb Hartford led at ACT at Simon Fraser University, was a low carbon resilience conceptual model. And I won't go into the details here, just the idea that by aligning the adaptation planning and action process with the mitigation planning and action process, we can start to identify when we're examining our solutions where there might be conflicts that we can minimize, where there might be synergies that we can maximize as we move forward with our investment and our action plan, and not treat these as separate activities. And then my last comment I'll talk about is on asset management, which can be defined as providing the required level of service as cost effectively as possible, taking into account future needs and stresses. The level of service, for example, how many people are served well by that infrastructure. Cost effective, you understand. Taking into account future needs such as population growth, and then looking at how do we minimize total cost of ownership over the full life cycle, from planning and design all the way to construction, operation, maintenance, and disposal. Right? We want to reduce the total cost of ownership, so we're saving whether it's taxpayer money or corporate money or individual money. We've got to look at the full picture, and we've got to ask how is climate change going to affect both levels of service in terms of how well the infrastructure can do its job, as well as total cost of ownership. And to do that, I think that we need to integrate climate change into the various financial processes that occur within any particular government or corporation body to minimize total cost of ownership. Often the functions of capital planning, capital budgeting, of operation and maintenance happen in different departments, operating on different timescales with different matrix, with different metrics. If we can align these, then we really stand an opportunity to maximize those synergies between adaptation and mitigation. I'll leave you when you get the slide of a number of studies that are out there, some recent ones that Deb has led, some that I've led, if you want to dig in a bit deeper on green resilience and low carbon resilience. So I thank you for your attention, for your patience with the technology, and really look forward to Deb and Allison's presentation and to the Q&A.
here to the first slide of our presentation. Alexa, can you just put my headshot up? There we go, that'd be great. Rather than the video, I think it's better at this point. So, hi everybody. It's great to have an opportunity to speak to you today. Alexa's already introduced us, so I won't waste too much time other than to say that I'll be handing over to my colleague, Dr. Alison Shaw, in about 10 minutes, and Alison will talk to you about the work we're doing with local government in depth. So I'm just going to build on Steve's presentation. As Steve mentioned, green resilience and low carbon resilience are really referring to the same concept. We're talking about low carbon because there's such an urgency to reduce emissions, and just I'm putting a line under that. Our work is at SFU is applied research with local governments, looking at how this is working for them on the ground. We want to make this something into practical resources and guides that local governments can use as they work on their climate action challenges, of course, of which there are many. So I just want to address the fact is that to date, when we talk about adaptation, so this is planning for climate change impact, they have been being done separately. And the reason for that is that, the first realization was that emissions were causing climate change. So we started working on what we call mitigation, which is emissions reduction in this context. And only later did we have to accept that we weren't going to be able to stop it all, and that there were going to be climate impact no matter how well we did with our emissions reduction. And so that is this thing called adaptation. And in the research, they developed separately. And what that's led to is us doing them separately. And we're, as Steve has pointed out, fast realizing that that is not an efficient use of money and time. And the encouraging thing here is that the IPCC, which has produced a lot of the research that has driven this thinking, is really pointing to this need to implement them in an integrated manner now, and that this can be really beneficial. And that adaptation itself can be quite emissions intensive, and adaptation options that reduce emissions can provide synergies and cost savings. So this is at least the research is also going in this direction. So I think we'll increasingly see this approach coming up everywhere as we go forward into a world in which we know we have to build our climate resilience and reduce our emissions at the same time. So this is what Steve has discussed, but I'll just reiterate. The low carbon resilience approach aims to reduce our current climate risk by addressing key vulnerabilities and acknowledging that those climate changes are going to keep happening for the coming decades. We minimize those cumulative climate risks by reducing our emissions over time as fast as we can, and that we advance the resilience part of this equation so that it's a no regrets approach. It's a win-win-win by aligning our climate action with other priorities that communities and Canadians have as top their values, equity, health, economic development. So this is integrating it all into strategic thinking and planning. And this is super important. If you just look at the bottom left quadrant here, we have high vulnerability and And this is really landing in terms of asset management. And obviously, capital assets are where the biggest investment goes and often where a lot of the emissions are coming from. And so if you look at asset management, VCs plan, they're building in this kind of thinking to that planning process. And this is really important because of those huge investments in assets, as Steve has pointed out. Climate amplifies your risk, it increases your costs, you're going to have to replace those assets more frequently or fix them, and it also makes it more difficult to deliver desired levels of service over time. And so it's very important to think about what are the levels of service we want to provide and build that in. So in terms of asset management, here are the main categories that people think about and that happen at the local government level. And obviously we've got a bit of a focus here on land transportation. But essentially, when you're looking at large-scale planning, it's going to include all of these. But we're focusing in on the land transportation today. And that's really important because of the level of emissions that are coming from that sector. The country's second leading source of GHGs is 28%, and if you drill down to the local government level, it's more like 40% of the local government emissions, 60% from buildings, 40% from transportation. And so one of the conclusions is, in cities at any rate, yes, we can move to low emissions technologies, but there's other strategic ways to move people around that can help reduce these emissions, like better public transportation. This is going to be really important in the future because cities are growing massively. There's some quite staggering facts about how much cities are going to grow in the next few decades. More and more people moving into them. 64% of all vehicle kilometers are traveled in cities, and that's going to be getting bigger, as I say. And so again, we've got to come back to this use of more sustainable modes of transport. And this we're going to amplify this message through the low carbon resilience talk. And the first example, one example I have for you guys, is from this report that we put out in 2019. This is on ACT's website at act-adapt.org. And it goes through low carbon resilience examples that already exist. And I think there's also, it's worth pointing out that sometimes we're actually already doing these things, and it would be nice for us to have ways to get credit for that and account for that. And so these point out examples at the building, neighborhood, and community levels. And one of them is Fredericton, which is doing active transportation corridors because they're having really bad flooding on their roads, which is cutting people off. And so they've invested in active transportation corridors to enable people to get around. This helps people who can't afford cars. It's good for health. It's also good for biodiversity. And so we start getting into that multiple benefit thinking. We also need to get a little bit more creative and expansive with our thinking in terms of these co-benefits. Because, for instance, not many people are making a connection between the switch to something like electric vehicles or electric transportation, and therefore the reduction in tailpipe emissions. So that would be your mitigation focus. Now, your adaptation focus would be that because of the lag in the climate system and the amount of heat that's going to increase over the coming decades, we know that tailpipe emissions combined with high heat conditions cause ground level ozone, and that's really damaging to the lungs. So then we get into, increasing people's danger in terms of COVID. And so you're actually getting a major health benefit that's compounded by the fact that as climate change advances, we'll see more wildfire smoke, and living in Vancouver, I can tell you that's something we're really aware of right now. So there's your mitigation approach that's actually benefiting health in a climate risk and adaptation sense. So this is another example of this thinking. Another thing about the active transportation routes is, as I've mentioned, the possibility of improving habitat for biodiversity. We put out another report early this year in 2020 on how local governments can think about the value for mitigation and adaptation and these other benefits that using nature-based solutions provide. And they're really substantial. They're in the millions and billions. So I do encourage you to have a look at that report. And thinking about green infrastructure or natural assets, green infrastructure can refer to putting in things like rain gardens or green roofs. Thinking about how you connect those up over a regional scale gives you bigger benefits and bigger features. You get more flood absorption, more heat reduction, more emissions sequestration, more carbon absorption. So, that's a little bit of an overview of some of the big picture thinking we're doing on low carbon resilience. And as I say, there's also reports on those things on our website. And then I'll hand over to Alison to talk about the research that she's leading for us with our local community, NBC.
Thank you so much, Deb. I just lost the presentation, not sure why. So if it could be reloaded, that would be great. Thank you. There we go. It's back. Okay. So thank you for the opportunity to be here today for us to share really leading edge research on embedding climate action, integrated climate action into local government settings. So Deb and I have been working on the Mitigation project. I'm sorry, I've just lost my slides again. I'm not sure what's happening in the background here, but I'll continue assuming someone's working on it. The Integrated Climate Action for BC Communities Initiative, which we fondly refer to as ICABICI, is a research project that Deb and I designed 3 years ago to be action-oriented, to work with BC partner communities, so local governments across BC, in order to co-create and embed this concept of low carbon resilience or integrated climate action planning into local government decision processes. And so we've been working with 13 partner communities, including Prince George, which is missing on the right, as well as Gibsons, over the past 2 years. And we just wanted to share with you some of the learnings and lessons from that research. But the end goal of this research is to build a low carbon resilience framework of action that can be applied across Canada to local governments at various scales of climate action. So really the goal of this research is to identify key entry points for low carbon resilience in local government planning, policy, and decision processes, and focusing on key areas of how to streamline and mainstream limited resources and capacities in order to bridge adaptation and mitigation planning. So often they're done in silos, as both Steve and Deb have noted. And we understand that contradictions can happen when adaptation and mitigation planning is done in silos, and that it often sits separate from things like corporate strategy and land use planning, etc. And so we're looking at opportunities in local governments to streamline and also mainstream climate action planning. We're also looking at ways that climate action and this type of integration can synergize with other policy areas across local government departments. And the goal really is to advance climate action that synergizes with work that's already going on and also advances a no regrets approach. So looking at advancing things like equity and health and biodiversity and economic development even. So the goal of the research really is to apply an empirical lens to some of this work in the local government context in order to see how this concept of low carbon resilience, what the benefits are, what the challenges are, and what the opportunities are for local governments to accelerate what they need to do on climate action. And so, again, a framework for local government use will be coming out in 2021. To date, we have been working with climate action planning, which is the obvious entry point into local government. So adaptation, mitigation planning have been done in silos with separate expertise and professional skill sets. We have a draft low carbon resilience planning process that we are applying in a certain number of our communities to bridge those silos and ensure that the risk and vulnerability assessment work that's used as a preface to adaptation planning and the emissions inventory and forecasting work that's used to preface mitigation planning actually is data that is co-evaluated in one planning process. So already the benefit you see here is streamlining what are typically two planning processes with two, budgets associated into one. The other benefit that we're starting to see is that we're engaging staff across organizational departments that work on adaptation and or mitigation and or infrastructure, and having them consider what the synergies and trade-offs are of different climate action strategies. So again, as Deb mentioned, really the overall goal of this research is to ensure that local governments and decision makers and organizations across Canada start applying a low carbon resilience lens. And all of that means, as we've heard before, is minimizing the risks and key vulnerabilities that are presented under climate change projections. So reducing vulnerabilities to infrastructure over time, applying climate projections, as well as reducing vulnerabilities to vulnerable populations and ecosystems over time. It also is emphasizing, asking the question of how we can reduce emissions that are currently being emitted in our communities, and also how can we build decision processes and plans to avoid emissions into the future. And both of these concepts are combined with thinking through a no regrets approach. So aligning with other community priorities such as equity, health, economic development. And so currently we have been meeting local governments where they're at. So the idea here is that low carbon resilience doesn't have to be an ideal scenario. It can build on as a lens where local governments are. And what you'll see in this slide is that we're working with communities such as Port Moody. I see some of the logos are missing. So Port Moody on the left has done very little on climate action to date. And Surrey is considered to be a leader. Surrey is on the right, and they have done a lot on climate action. I'm not sure where these logos went, but bear with me. And so we're working with the full spectrum of local governments and meeting them where they're at on climate change. So in the case of Port Moody on the far left, we have applied that low carbon resilience planning framework that I just showed you. Because they had very limited climate action in their local government, we were able to lead them through an ideal low carbon resilience planning process. And they have just now approved a low carbon resilience plan, the second in Canada, and have gone from doing very little on climate action to being leaders in Canada, which is very exciting. A lot of communities in British Columbia, because of the BC Climate Action Charter, have done quite a bit of work on emissions inventorying and forecasting, but far fewer have done any work on adaptation planning. And so we're working with a lot of local government partners to build on where they're at. So if they have an emissions plan, to start strategizing and identifying where the key synergies are with adaptation planning. Surrey is on the far right of this graphic, and they have been leaders. They have an actual climate action plan that includes mitigation and adaptation strategies, but those strategies still remain siloed. They were developed in a sort of coordinated manner, but not co-evaluated, looking for policy synergies and so forth. And I will share some of the work that we're doing with Surrey later on in the project on transportation and land use planning. But for now, there are three pathways that have come to light through our research to date. Pathway one is in the lower left-hand box there. We're calling it low carbon resilience light. It's kind of where cities like Prince George have siloed adaptation mitigation plans and just want to kind of coordinate them to create one climate action plan and strategy. We have Path 2, which is planning for low carbon resilience, which, as I mentioned, we took Port Moody through a low carbon resilience planning process where climate action data is co-evaluated as it relates to adaptation mitigation and advancing other community priorities. And so we've got a couple of communities that are integrating their climate action planning. But the overall goal of this particular research is to embed and mainstream low carbon resilience into all policy planning and decision processes. And so we're working with a couple of communities on that. As you'll see, the town of Gibson's actually is a real leader in applying a low carbon resilience lens to its entire corporate strategy. So everything from risk management to resource management to investment planning. They're asking the critical questions of does it reduce vulnerability, does it reduce emissions, and does it advance other community priorities? Similarly, the district of Summerland, tiny little community here in the Okanagan, has just embedded low carbon resilience into its business prioritization framework so that all projects over $10,000 include low carbon resilience criteria. So fundamentally shifting procurement policy. The villages of Silverton and Spokane are immensely tiny and are looking to the future by embedding low carbon resilience into their asset management planning process so that they're including the rich diversity of natural assets in their future plans, investment planning for infrastructure. So these are some of the approaches some of the entry points and approaches that are being used in our local government case communities and park communities. The one that I wanted to get into and is very relevant to the call today is Surrey is a partner community with Mitigation. And as mentioned in 2013, Surrey became a leader at a climate action strategy that actually had both mitigation and adaptation strategies in it. But as mentioned, those strategies still remain siloed. And so what Surrey is interested in doing now is using those strategies and developing a prioritization scenario so that those strategies can actually just move straight into practice. So they're applying, a low carbon resilience lens, so reducing risks and vulnerabilities, emissions, and advancing co-benefits, to a process that is going to essentially build a low carbon resilience workshop prior to the land use and transportation master planning processes. So what we've constructed here is using low carbon resilience and equity as lenses to build out land use plans and transportation plans in a coordinated manner. And so this is really exciting because it's getting different actors from across the organization talking about how to synergize some of these ideas. And so some of the initial ways that we're going to be doing this in a workshop, our very first workshop tomorrow with Surrey, is looking at the climate action strategies that were created in 2013, figuring out how the climate projections need to be updated, and then cross-evaluating which adaptation mitigation actions from that particular plan can actually accelerate some big moves for Surrey in land use and transportation planning. And so big moves are those critical LCR strategies, those low carbon resilient strategies like building a low carbon resilient neighborhood, for instance, and low carbon resilient features, and in blue, the mitigation features. So, for instance, to build a low carbon resilient neighborhood in Surrey, one of the strategies will be to build and require and encourage landscape features that provide cooling, biodiversity, and support natural hydrology. On the other side, with mitigation, reform zoning in low-density neighborhoods for mixed uses and multifamily housing. And for both, building low-carbon resilient levees for new developments to protect and restore biodiversity, sequester carbon, and fund climate action. So this low-carbon resilience approach would essentially be twinning the BC Energy Step Code, which is advancing as we speak, as well as dovetailing it with green building standards, for instance, and ensuring that there's a levy or a fund of some sort to support the incentivization of that. They also, in this particular process, are looking to build out critical equity strategies. And so what you'll see in the pink is the links to equity. So, for instance, if we're reforming zoning in low-density neighborhoods, how can we do this in a way that addresses affordability and prevents gentrification impacts that we often see in the development of new areas? So we're trying to think about how these things integrate, where the big strategies are in terms of how to build forward, and how to link land use and low carbon resilient neighborhoods with zero carbon healthy transportation mode shift. So how do these kind of planning processes interconnect? Well, if we're thinking about low carbon resilient neighborhoods, we're also thinking about green slope streets and connecting those neighborhoods via healthy transportation modes such as active transportation networks. We're thinking about how to incorporate street trees and rain gardens and absorb the excess rainfall that's projected under climate change in the future, as well as to provide cooling effects under heat events into the future. And we're also thinking about how to ensure access for more vulnerable populations, such as seniors, the low socioeconomic bracket of society, as well as people with disabilities and health issues. So this, for instance, providing subsidies for e-bikes could look at deeper subsidies for people with low income, or prioritizing retrofits and access to transportation in neighborhoods, in low-income neighborhoods, in order to support cost savings over time is one of the solutions here. So we're really looking forward to working with Surrey in the coming months on this really exciting twinning of land use and transportation planning, and looking for the big low carbon resilient moves within that particular local government and community. And we're really excited about moving some of this planning that we've been doing for the past couple of years with our partner community forward into implementation, the primary goal of the project. And I just wanted to bring you back to the beginning of the project, which started in the fall of 2018. We brought all of our partner communities into the same room back when you could still sit in a workshop together. And we asked them where the key entry points for a low carbon resilience approach could be applied in a local government context. And back then, they said asset management planning, corporate strategic planning, and various master planning processes like climate action planning, transportation planning, land use planning. And this is exactly how this whole action-oriented kind of emergent research is being guided as we in the fall of 2021 that can be applied to communities across Canada. But in the interim, until that's done, we are sharing our lessons learned in multiple ways through sample best examples, briefings, and communications tools. We're sharing some of our ideas about ideal LCR process and some of the research and learning through occasional webinars. And so if you're interested, please do sign up to this particular email at info@adaptation.ca, and we'll add you to our peer learning network on how to embed low carbon resilience in local governments, but more broadly into organizations more broadly. So thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very, very much, Steve, Deborah, and Allison, for the informative presentations and for sharing your knowledge on green resilience strategies. It is quite clear that climate adaptation, mitigation, synergies are extremely important in building a more sustainable transportation system. I think it's safe to say today we've seen adaptation in real time with the technical issues that we've encountered, but I would like to take a moment to thank the presenters again for their patience and professionalism, and to you, the participants, as well, for providing us with constructive feedback in the chat so that we could mitigate the issue, no pun intended. So for those that missed the introduction, I just wanted to reintroduce myself, I should say. I am Alexa Bradley, and I'm the policy analyst with the Climate Change Adaptation Policy Team at Transport Canada, the team that is responsible for delivering our transportation adapting to a changing climate webinar series. And we will also be circulating the slides after the webinar along with the recording. The slides will be in English and French. So we have now come to our Q&A period. To those who have posed questions so far via the chat, thank you very much for your submissions. I see there's been quite an active conversation going on there, and thank you to the presenters for answering real time and providing links to resources. We're now going to try to answer as many as possible. And if anyone does have any further questions, please add them to the chat at this time, or should you wish to pose them verbally, you can do so now by hitting *6 to unmute your line. So I'm going to start with a question that was posed during Steve's presentation, and I'd like to thank Allison for providing a response that would give Steve the opportunity, and Deb as well, if there's anything you'd like to add. So the question was, what is gray infrastructure? And Allison had responded saying gray infrastructure refers to engineered infrastructure, thinking of pipes, culverts, seawalls, etc. And that green infrastructure refers to using nature-based solutions to absorb rainfall, stormwater ponds, rainforests, bioswales. So if there's anything else that Steve or Debbie would like to add.
Nope, that's right on for me. There's so much jargon here that I appreciate the clarifying question. And I think some of the biggest jargon are the words mitigation and adaptation, which most people don't really have in their daily vocabulary and can often be different things. So I think it's important that we're, defining terms and figuring out, how this can connect, how people can understand it in day-to-day terms. I think a lot of it comes down to how can we save money and time, then you get people's attention. Use the jargon later.
Yeah, this is Deb. I'll absolutely agree with that. I think that's one of the reasons why we use the word resilience a lot more than adaptation these days. People intuitively understand the concept of resilience, which is slightly different from adaptation. But resilience is what happens if you adapt. So anyway, so it's just on the green infrastructure thing. I mean, you can engineer green infrastructure. So to say that gray infrastructure is engineered infrastructure could also apply to green, because now we're doing a lot of things like green roofs or bioswales, which essentially are engineered, if you want to use that terminology. So I think the gray more specifically refers to the use of literally the colors, concrete, cement. It's man-made materials that often have very high embodied emissions.
the process type of thing. So, it's really a shift. The green represents things that are made with organic, nature-based approaches, and gray is a bit more of that kind of prefabricated, man-made stuff. And I'd just like to jump into it, and thanks for the clarification, Deb, to clarify also that green infrastructure and nature-based solutions have the two primary benefits, which is absorbing rainfall, which is projected to increase under climate change, as well as providing cooling effects to buildings and individuals and active transportation corridors and so forth, under projected the increased frequency and magnitude of climate heat events.
And maybe I'll jump in and add one more comment, and is that, we're often in our silos when it comes to green infrastructure or nature-based solutions, and I think it can be interesting to see, where are strategic ways and places to target green infrastructure, vegetation, protect natural assets to achieve multiple benefits. And, just asking that question might take you, out of just flood mitigation and looking at where there are real heat island concerns or other community benefits that can be advanced.
Yeah, I'd like to build on that. That's a really great point, Steve. And I think it's, what we're seeing as cities get into things like, let's say, Vancouver's Green City Strategy, where they're really trying to apply their stormwater management to shift it to nature-based solutions approach. It means that engineers and other professionals, engineers and biologists are having to work together in ways they haven't before. And so there's a real need to kind of break down silos, not just between practitioners working on adaptation and practitioners working on mitigation, but practitioners working across the spectrum in the professions. And so you get interesting initiatives like the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative, which is working very hard to ensure that we start to actually value the presence of the nature-based components that we have, like parks, forests, foreshores, and understand the value that they're providing and quantify that in different ways. And the main way that they're quantifying them right now is what you're not paying in flood damages because that asset is there. So what would you have to pay? What damages would you be experiencing if it was taken away? And because engineers are so crucial to the planning of any kind of project like that, they're also developing an entire set of standards and accreditation for engineers on how to plan and contribute to the implementation of natural assets and nature-based solutions, which is, I think, a very constructive way to have professionals sort of leap into this new way of thinking.
Thank you to all of you for that build-on discussion. We do have a couple more questions here. The next ones, I think they were directed at Steve, but again, would be happy for all of you to respond. So this one is, what do you think about adopting higher insulation standards, for example, passive house to improve thermal efficiency versus green roofs?
Well, this is Deb. I would reply to that one right away, so I'll just go straight away, which is just that, yes, absolutely. I mean, anything we can do to reduce our building emissions is great. Passive house is really wonderful. But there's only one concern, which I put in the chat box, which is just that because of the projected increases in heat, even if we reduce our emissions to zero today, we're going to, fairly good, I think, projections that show even in the best case scenario, we'll have significantly increased heat. Canada's warming twice as fast as the rest of the world. So best case scenario, we'll see increased heat by 2050 and more by later in the century. And the fear is that, well, not fear, but the calculation is actually the passive house measures are great, but they won't be sufficient to cool enough. And sometimes you get people saying, well, we'll be needing to warm less, so that balances out in terms of energy use, but it doesn't actually because they're different systems. And so passive house plus, I think, is what's needed in order to sort of low carbon resilience approach, especially if you're using energy emissions intensive energy sources.
I'll not repeat what Deb said, and more about some of those details than I do, but I'll just say that especially with more of us of electricity systems, natural gas systems, insulating your house now has mitigation, and resilience benefits that, looking to whether it's, storage on site in a house, battery storage, which tends to be pretty expensive, or community based solutions or microgrids, I think become more and more important. We talk about 15-minute communities, which are, really important when you're working from home now, when you walk to the store, can you reach the things that you need. But we also need, 14-day communities when the pandemic, started, when we were first isolated. It's like, you better have enough food for, to survive for 2 weeks. So bringing energy thinking into that, and the resilience of the structures that we spend our time in, there's all that much more needs to do that.
Thank you, Devin. We have a question here about the task force on climate-related financial disclosure. So, does the task force incorporate climate into capital planning sufficiently, in your opinion? Well, this step, no, because local governments aren't looking at that. That's for private sector. So, if you're talking about capital planning, then I don't think local governments are looking at the TCFD or TSDD. I would say that model up. So it's very influential, and it's really good to get the private sector thinking about it. But I think local governments need are in a whole other situation. And now you've got things like the British Columbia Hazard Risk and Vulnerability Assessment, which actually today did not include the requirement for local governments to consider future climate conditions, but is now does now include that, and we're actually piloting that with one of our Ikabiki community partners. But that's really new. So it depends on the context. I don't know enough about what the TSDD requires from private sector, but I do think it's a really good development, because the private sector is such a huge influence here.
Thank you, Deb. We have a standards question. There are a number of different green standards, for example, net zero, carbon zero. What equivalent standards exist for climate resilience, and how might they be combined with mitigation standards?
Yeah, this is Alison responding to that question, which is a frequent one that comes up in local government context. What we know about adaptation planning versus as distinct from mitigation planning is it's not as formulaic. So emissions are fairly easy to track and monitor, but adaptation features are far more contextual in practice when you're applying them in local context. But that doesn't mean that there aren't standard approaches that can be used. And so this is one of the things that we're looking at in our research, especially this concept that I brought up about dovetailing the energy step code standards with green development standards that consider shade trees when building new buildings, consider embodied emissions in new building materials, consider potential flood impacts of the positionality of buildings, ensuring that you're not building in high risk zones, and if you are, that you've got contingency plans. Building out this concept of nature-based infrastructure, so using green gardens as opposed to lawns, that help take the burden off stormwater management systems. So there's lots of strategies and approaches that could inform a standard alongside BC Energy, or the equivalent of an energy step code. And so this is one of the things that we're trying to work on more at the local government level, but also pushing from above at the provincial level as well, and the federal government level, to start kind of twinning and aligning
Thank you, Allison. We have a participant that has commented saying, so that the city of Calgary is currently trying to figure out what climate change governance might look like in their organization and how to apply a climate lens. And the question is, when do you anticipate the ICA BCCI work to be complete and published and to be used by municipalities?
Well, we are building out the case studies right now in our partner communities across the province of BC, and we're empirically evaluating what's working, what's not working, what some of the trade-offs are for low carbon resilience at the city scale, and we will collate all of that information into a framework for action by the fall of 2021. That is our research funding deadline. However, as I noted on my last slide, we are pushing out learning, key learning and key resources that local governments have used and can use in an open source way through our website, and also through our peer learning network. So if the city of Calgary wanted to sign up as a partner on our peer learning network, then they would be receiving these resources pretty frequently, and would be able to participate in webinars that we host on some of these topics. So we're trying to convey the research as we move along in the research process. And we're trying to build out really relevant resources for local governments as we move through this particular research process.
Yeah, and that's exactly, and just to build on that, we're also keen to learn from them. So, there are other local governments elsewhere in Canada, Mississauga is one that I can think of, that are pioneering this kind of approach too. And, really that's one of the reasons we're doing it, because it emerges as really badly needed by local governments with low capacity. They often have one person trying to do their, adaptation risk and vulnerability assessment and their mitigation plan, and they can see these connections, but they're not receiving support to do them in an integrated way. And so, it's emerging just organically. I mean, we're just kind of trying to help a wave along maturity building.
Sorry, I think we may have had someone unmute their line. We could just mute until the presenters are done. Sorry, Deb, was there anything else you'd like to add?
No, that's all I was saying.
I'll just add that if you're interested in learning more about these resources, then sign up with your learning network that Deb put in the chat box at info@sfu.ca.
Maybe, Alexa, I've been chatting a little bit with Liza Klein, who posed a question about, things that may have a high upfront cost, like electric transit or public transit. How do you make the case for that? And I shared some links to some book I wrote on the topic and a blog that I call Making the Case for Net Cost Per Ton. I talked about co-benefits and multi-solving really from a perspective of accelerating implementation, which I think is important. But often in the mitigation world, when we're really focusing on narrow direct cost per ton, there are a lot of investments that look very expensive. It's often said, public transit, well, that's a high cost per ton. It's not really a good mitigation strategy. Yet you see developers, getting rich because they own land near transit stations. So we really need to look out and look at the system effects when we integrate land use and transportation planning, bring in, housing, and when we start to quantify some of the economic benefits to businesses, to individuals, increase return on investment, cost savings, something that seems, expensive in a very narrow sort of incremental costs, like if you're just looking at public expenditure, when you look at the societal benefits, it becomes a net benefit per ton. So I think we've got to be careful or be aware of, you know, how narrowly we're focusing the lens and when it makes sense to zoom out a little bit and see the bigger picture.
Thanks, Steve. Seeing that we're about 5 minutes from the end here, perhaps I'll ask Deb and Allison, were there any questions you saw in the chat or may have responded to that you'd like to take this opportunity to expand on?
Sure, I'll respond to the question about the low carbon levy. So this is just an idea phase. And, you know, I think someone in the chat referred to development cost charges as a way to incentivize something like that. I think that's probably going to be the best approach. This hasn't been applied yet. As I mentioned, we're just starting this whole process with very rolling it out. I mean, there's been a lot of thought going on behind the scenes, but we're rolling out the process across the organization starting tomorrow. And so some of these ideas will become more actionable in the coming months. But I can imagine development cost charges being a critical lever in that. We do know that, like for natural asset management and nature-based solutions, the town of Gibson has been working with developers on developing development cost charge reductions for developers that start paying attention to kind of nature-based solutions. And there's been a really great example of a win-win situation there in Gibson that, you know, we're thinking could be applied at a much larger community scale. So we'll see how that rolls out, and we'll definitely maintain the update. Yeah, this is Deb. I'm just putting in the chat a link to a report that we put out on ways to pay for urban infrastructure adaptation. So because we're trying to think in a low carbon resilience way, this doesn't quite capture that, but it does point to other ways that people are paying for risk reduction in an infrastructure context. I'm just going to post that, and if you're interested in that, it's actually built on an earlier report. It's also on our website from 2015 that has an extremely comprehensive analysis of all the different ways that people are paying for urban infrastructure adaptation in Canada. But of course, a lot happened between 2015 and 2020, including a new federal government and new sources of revenue. So we updated it in 2020. But if you also look at the low carbon resilience interventions report that I posted a bit earlier, which I can post again if you like, it has another example of another low carbon resilience measure that's a stormwater levy that the city of Victoria has put on its stormwater bills. It's a really creative way to pay for basically nature-based solutions reduce emissions not just by absorbing and sequestering carbon, but by reducing emissions-intensive processes needed, for instance, to power air conditioning or to process stormwater. And so there's an emissions benefit there. And the city of Victoria has done an interesting project where they've put on the utilities bill a measurement of what the assessment is of how much runoff of stormwater might be coming from a homeowner's property, and then a discount on that bill if the homeowner can show that they've implemented something like a rain garden or something that can reduce the runoff. So there's a lot of really creative ways people are getting into this, and some of them are in the finance reports that I mentioned. I'll just put that in the chat, the 2015 one as well, and then I'll quickly put in the low carbon resilience interventions one again, which gives you case studies from across Canada and points to lots of different resources on how to do these kinds of calculations and And just to follow up on that, in terms of nature-based solutions, a lot of the work that's been done to date on nature-based solutions is determining a business case for using rain gardens and forests and green spaces and building in permeable areas in order to reduce the burden on stormwater management systems, especially under demographic growth projections. And the business case is definitely there when accounting for only demographic growth, but it builds when you start considering future climate conditions and the ability for natural solutions to adjust and have more agility under changing conditions in the future. And so I just put up in the chat forum an Vicky report on the LPR benefits of natural assets and nature-based solutions, which also has a lot of costing information in it, but that's helpful to start thinking about how to use proxy data to make the business case for these kinds of things.
Well, thank you very much, Steve, Deborah, and Allison, for answering the participants' question in great detail and providing all these excellent resources. I do apologize to those whose questions we weren't able to address today, but perhaps we can look into exploring and reviewing the chat to see if we can follow up where feasible. So on that note, I hope everyone enjoyed today's webinar. I'd like to thank our presenters again for their time and efforts today, as well as you, the audience, for your attendance and participation. And I'd additionally like to thank my colleagues